Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, welcome to episode 93 of the Monday Night Review. It's bloody snowing here, but it's British snowing. It's not, beautiful white fields. It's just bloody freezing with massive drops of snow flakes that then melt sadly. There's a slight delay. You may have noticed that it's Tuesday. I spent 10 and a half hours driving the car up to Ilkley Moor on Sunday so that my husband could see his brother. And yesterday, I was just playing mental catch-up and finishing off the research for this episode. The drive itself was fine. But the last hour in the car, I was just contemplating opening the door and rolling out. I was so sick of being in there. My husband did the last 2 hours driving. I did the rest because I had a nap in the boot with the dog while he was visiting his brother. So I felt the more refreshed out of both of us. But, oh, God, it was dull. Weirdly, also here in the news is a murder that's not dissimilar to the doorstep murder that's happened in Glasgow. A man has been shot on his doorstep. Weirdly, the murder of Alistair Wilson happened in Nairn in the Highlands, and the murder last week happened on Nairn Road in Glasgow. But I believe 2 men have already been charged for this most recent murder. So thankfully, I don't think we're going to have the unsolved horror that we've had with the doorstep murder. If you haven't listened to that, it's a few episodes back. I would give a trigger warning for this episode. Do talk about abortion, not in depth, but it is a factor in one of the cases that we talk about today. So if that is something that you're going to find too much, I completely understand, and maybe this is an episode to skip. You could go back and listen to a previous episode that you've... My sources for today are a Medium article by Lisa Marie Fuqua, a Town and Country magazine article by Keith Hayes, truecrimeedition.com, and Good Old British Newspaper Archive. I would say that whilst searching on the British Newspaper Archive, I found a disturbing amount of women's bodies being found in trunks, especially I narrowed my search down to the 1930s, and there's still numerous cases of bodies being found in trunks, women's bodies, and it reminded me of that quote that's a distillation from something said by Margaret Atwood on the radio in the 80s. Men are afraid that women will laugh at them and women are afraid that men will kill them. And so with that in mind, we're going into today's episode. Today we're looking at the Brighton Trunk murders, which sounds a lot like something from an Agatha Christie novel. And indeed, they mainly take place in the 1930s near the sea, which just adds to the whole Christie vibe. So let's take a trip to Brighton, the queen of watering places back in the 1930s, though by the end of the decade, people have dubbed it the queen of slaughtering places because of the incidents that we're going to talk about today. Brighton then, as is the case now, was a popular seaside resort town known for its vibrant nightlife, entertainment and leisure activities. The town had a population of around 160,000 people, and it attracted many tourists from around the UK and abroad. With well-established train network and regular services to London and other major cities in the UK, the town also had a tram system which operated until 1939 when it was replaced by buses. One of the most famous attractions in Brighton in the 1930s was the Palace Pier, which opened in 1899 and was one of the longest piers in the UK. It offered a variety of amusements such as rides, games and sideshows, as well as restaurants and cafes. Another popular attraction was the Royal Pavilion, which was built in the early 19th century for King George IV. The pavilion had a distinctive Indian-inspired architecture and was surrounded by beautiful gardens. Brighton also had a thriving music scene in the 1930s, with many famous bands and musicians performing in the town's numerous music halls and theatres. It was also home to several dance clubs and nightclubs, attracting both locals and visitors, and the fact that it was just 60 miles from London made the bumpy, uncomfortable train journey worth it, because it was a popular spot for weekends away, for those wanting some sea air, or to get up to no good with someone they shouldn't be getting up to no good with. On the 17th of June 1934, William Joseph Vinicum was working at the left luggage office at Brighton Station. It was a warm day and he noticed a foul smell coming from somewhere in the office. He looked around for where the stench could be coming from and found an unclaimed plywood trunk that had been in the left luggage office for about 11 days. Immediately suspicious, he called the police, and the job of opening the trunk fell to Chief Inspector Ronald Donaldson. Nice name. Inside, they found layers of paper and cotton wool soaked in blood. Under that was a parcel tied with a sash cord containing a female torso. They sent out an alert to other stations that this had happened and that the torso was missing limbs and a head, and the next day the dismembered legs were found at King's Cross Station in a trunk. The head and arms were never found. The police began a review of around 700 cases of missing women and checked in at hospitals and known abortionists, but no clues were found. Soon enough, the press started to call the victim Pretty Feet because she had apparently dancer's feet. Now, to me, dancer's feet, I think, are not pretty feet. Dancer's feet are hard-working feet. Obviously, there must be a difference between dancer's feet and ballerina's feet. I'm thinking of ballerina's point feet, which look quite mangled. Famous doctor and pathologist Dr. Bernard Spilsbury examined the torso and legs, confirming that they belonged to the same person. A woman of around 25 years old, 5 months pregnant. The dismemberment showed some level of skill, though we've heard this before and it turned out not to be true. And without wanting to sound too gross, I did a cookery course and I learned how to joint a chicken, I just had a flashback memory. I actually got thrown out of one class because I asked how would you joint it? Bloody hell. What a weird teenager I was. I think I asked if you would joint a person in the same way. Just out of interest. They thought that was inappropriate, which I now understand. So I'm 39. I think if I was to lose my mind and have to dismember a person, I would go about it the same way as jointing a chicken. It's a little sidebar there to make you all terrified. So yes, what I mean is, I don't think it takes necessarily, if you understand that, I think I could give a fair crack at, that was a bad use of words, dismembering a person. So I'm not sure what they mean about level of skill. If we ever cover Jack the Ripper, that I think did show skill because of what happens with internal organs, but in terms of removing heads and limbs, not quite as technical. I'm really sorry if that's grossed anyone out. Chief Inspector Donaldson said in his notes, quote, "Internal examination of the torso had not revealed the cause of death. The victim had been well nourished, stood above 5 foot 2 inches and weighed roughly 8.5 stone. Now, in some accounts of this case, they say that she died from a head injury, but I can't, in the sources, for example, newspapers of the time, it says that the head was not found. So that's what I'm going with. The fact that she was pregnant could give an idea of motive. Obviously, they never found her arms, so we don't know if she was wearing a wedding ring. So again, this is all speculation, but the fact that she was pregnant could give an idea of motive for her murder or death, and rumours began to circulate that she was killed during a backstreet abortion by Brighton-based Dr. Edward Messiah. I think it's important to note that, sadly, this is a topic of today, but banning abortion doesn't get rid of abortions. It only gets rid of safe abortions, and that's what's so frustrating. So the police questioned Messiah, but due to his well-connected clients, Donaldson was told to back off. He had, in fact, got some of his men to follow the doctor to see if he led them anywhere, and they were confronted and told to leave him alone. And basically, he had performed surgeries for people high up and was above the law. So Masai would go on to move his practice to London, where he again escaped conviction when a woman died during an abortion. Now, at the time that this happened, Dr. Bernard Spilsbury's career was in a decline, and this would become evident throughout the end of his career. But I wonder, and I haven't seen the post-mortem results, but I do wonder if there is physical evidence that an abortion had been attempted. And I just don't know the answer to that. With no identity of the woman found in the trunk, it was impossible to find another suspect, and the crime is still unsolved today. Now, in July 1934, friends of Violet Kay became suspicious about her whereabouts and the strange smell in her boyfriend's flat, and they decided to call the police. Now, in some versions, I've seen that the police actually call upon his flat whilst conducting house-to-house inquiries about the body found in the trunk at the station. But in newspapers of the time, which is where I try and get the facts from, because I think obviously newspapers are not always factually accurate, but quite often they're quite a good indicator. They haven't been obviously had a modern spin on them. It didn't seem like the latter. It just seemed like Violet's friends were concerned they hadn't seen her, and so they get in contact with the police. Now, Violet had moved from London to Brighton with Tony Mancini in 1933, and when police arrived at 52 Kemp Street, they smelled a horrible and familiar smell. A search of the flat found a trunk placed at the bottom of the bed, covered in a cloth and being used as a coffee table. When it was opened, it was found to contain the body of a woman in a state of advanced decomposition. The smell was so unfathomably awful, and fluids were seeping out of the trunk onto the floor. And this is why friends had gone to the police, because Mancini kept insisting that the smell was coming from outside the flat, and there was nothing sinister going on. Their mind boggles. It must have been absolutely horrendous. The body would turn out to be that of 42-year-old dancer and sex worker Violet Kay, and the bedsit belonged to her boyfriend, Tony Mancini. Mancini was a 27-year-old waiter and bouncer who, and by all accounts a petty thief, who was questioned briefly by the police before going on the run. He was tracked down and arrested in London and brought back to Brighton, and when questioned, Mancini said he had arrived home to find Violet dead on the bed, and assuming that one of her clients had killed her, he panicked and shoved her in the trunk. The police were unconvinced. When searching the house, they found a chart that this is the house where they previously lived. They found a charred hammer in the basement, which Spilsbury confirmed would fit as the murder weapon. The last known sighting of Violet was on the 10th of May. So remember, this is taking place in July, at the Skylark Cafe where Mancini was working. And Violet appeared drunk and angry and got into a heated argument with Mancini, accusing him of having an affair with a teenage girl who was also working at the Skylark. In the weeks afterwards, Mancini told friends that Violet had left him and gone to Paris, and he started giving away her clothes and belongings. Violet's sister received a telegram, supposedly from Violet, saying, quote, "Going abroad, stop. Good job, stop. Sale Sunday, stop. Will write, Vi." Mancini then moved from Park Crescent, where he had lived with Violet, to 52 Kemp Street, taking the trunk containing Violet's body with him. On the 17th of July 1934, he was arrested for the murder of Violet Kay, and his trial began on the 10th of December that year. During the trial, a graphologist confirmed that the writing on the telegraph to Violet's sister matched writing samples taken from Mancini. The court also heard from Doris Saville, who had been asked by Mancini to give him an alibi for the time of Violet's murder. Other friends would testify that he, in the days after the last sighting of Violet, he boasted of giving his missus the hiding of a lifetime. Of course, we know what the defence will have said. Violet's line of work meant that lots of men will have had access to her home and the hammer, and that it was her fault, she was asking for it, all of that. The fact that Mancini had a record meant that he has said that he was sure the police wouldn't believe his story and thought it made more sense to hide the body instead. The jury deliberated for 2.25 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. So the fact that the hammer was burnt in the basement, the fact that they'd had a violent row, the fact that he then sent a telegram, I cannot believe this poor woman. I think this is what I find so chilling, is that he beats his girlfriend to death, covers it up badly, boasts about it, just shoves her body in a trunk and lives with it while it decomposes and gets away with it. And for me, that epitomises, I'm always trying to, my poor husband, I'm always trying to distill in him why sometimes it's just so scary to be a girl. And it's that sort of thing where you're like, you can just be shoved in a trunk and used as a coffee table. Obviously, hopefully that happens less now, but still. 42 years later, in 1976, while on his deathbed, Tony Mancini finally confessed to the murder of Violet Kay. Does he call the police and tell them? Does he tell a friend? No, he chose to do it to a journalist of the News of the World. If you are not from here, you might not know that the News of the World is such a horrific tabloid paper that it no longer exists anymore, which is saying something, because a lot of horrible tabloid papers still exist. The News of the World was so bad, it had to shut down. He told the journalist that the couple had been in the midst of a violent row when Violet came at him with a hammer that they used to break up coal for the fire. He wrestled it away from her, and then when she demanded he give it back, he threw it at her, hitting her on the left temple and killing her. Now, I have read in a few places that she was killed by a blow to the back of the head, which makes me question. I can totally see him like a bloody tantrumy baby flinging the hammer at her, but I wonder if again he's just like, yeah, I did it, but it was still her fault. It was an accident. I think he just had enough of her speaking to him like that at work and thought, I'm going to whack her around the head and stick her in a trunk. The fact that there were 2 bodies of murdered women found in trunks in Brighton at the same time was very strange. But they weren't the first, and that makes it even stranger. In 1831, John Holloway decided that he needed to do away with his wife, Celia. Holloway had worked as a painter on the Chain Bridge, and he met Celia, who was a chambermaid at the races, and somehow he persuaded her to sleep with him. Now, she became pregnant, and Holloway was not a nice guy, and refused to marry her, saying his salary of 2 shillings a week wasn't enough to support the child. So she went to her local town, Ardingly, and requested support from the council. And they said Holloway had to go to prison and think about his life choices. So he was sent to Lewes Prison, and after 5 weeks, he relented. I don't know why I've used that word. Relented. Oh, she's really pestering him. And said he would marry poor Celia, and the couple moved to Brighton, where sadly Celia gave birth to a stillborn child. Meanwhile, is Holloway being a nice guy? No. He is going out on the tiles. He's saying he doesn't fancy Celia. He doesn't like her. He's stuck with her. He wants to be rid of her. But at the same time, he manages to get her pregnant again, and then decides that the best thing to do is to go off to sea. So he boards a boat, possibly just before he goes or just when he gets back. He manages to impregnate another woman, Anne Kennett, and bigamously marries her. I think he probably quite likes Anne Kennett still. Not if you're married to someone else. Now, not wanting to face the consequences of his dickhead moves, the fact that he's now got 2 women who are pregnant, both of them he's married, doesn't seem to be treating either of them particularly well. He and Kennett decide that Celia has to be got rid of. Holloway persuades Celia to meet him at an empty Brighton tenement where he tells her that he's going to turn his life around, their life's going to be different, it's going to be lovely. And then he strangles her to death with a rope. And Anne Kennett is there to help. In some accounts, she helps him. In other accounts, they then hang Celia on a hook on a door to make sure that she's actually dead. Now, Holloway, who had once worked at a butcher's, decided that dismembering Celia would make the most sense, so he removes her head, legs and arms in a bid to make her easier to dispose of. Witnesses would later say that they noticed a wheelbarrow and trunk outside of Holloway's house that hadn't been there before or since, and Holloway and Kennett shoved Celia's arms and legs down the outside loo and then placed the rest of her remains in the trunk and used the wheelbarrow to take the trunk down a path called Lover's Walk to Preston Park, where Holloway buried the remains quite badly. The smell of rotting flesh would notify neighbours that all was not well in the outhouse, and a local fisherman noticed some red fabric in the soil in the park and noticed that there was this red fabric. It was recently disturbed soil, and so scooped a bit away with his hands and found Celia's torso. John Holloway is arrested. He is found guilty of the murder of Celia Holloway, and he is sentenced to death. Anne Kennett is found not guilty of helping Holloway murder his wife, but John Holloway would go to the gallows. Now, in 1831, he was tried at the Lewis Assizes, hanged nearby, and then his body was taken to Brighton, where it was put on display, and 25,000 people came to see it. It's a different existence, isn't it? Can you imagine that happening now? Anyway, the gruesome display of a man's body who had been hanged for murdering his wife was obviously not enough to put off the other men who decided to dispose of women in trunks, and that is the story of the Brighton Trunk murders. Absolutely horrendous. I would love it if some sort of amazing DNA forensic team could identify pretty feet. I really object to that. I mean, but then there's so many things wrong with this case, but I would love it if she was at least identified. It just seems so sad that somewhere a woman has disappeared and has ended up this way, and no one knows who she is. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined the Patreon and ordered t-shirts. I can't wait to see you in them. And I hope you're loving all the mini-sodes. I love doing them. You can buy me a coffee if you don't want to join the Patreon. You can email me at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Monday Night Review and TikTok at The Monday Night Review. Until next week, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seats before you drive.